Good evening. As the complex games apologist, it should come as no surprise that I'm something of an opponent of reductionism within the hobby. But tonight I'm on a special mission. I'm here to dispel the myth of the lazy GM, and that it's that easy. Because after all, what they're really saying is that there's no quality difference between a good dungeon master and a bad dungeon master. And we all know that's not true. But first, let me show you a convenient transition of me getting in my car and going back to the studio, and opening up a bottle of wine, so that no one gets confused. Thanks.
So for our usual disclaimer moment, I thought that I'd point out that I've procrastinated and prevaricated a really great deal about how I would approach this video and this topic, and so instead I decided to kind of wing it and make up most of my points here on the fly. So to give you a little bit of background about what the lazy GM polemic is to me, and as you'll probably pick it up and read it, it's sort of a compounding series of essays by people who do most of their improvising at the table, and that they don't do a whole lot of preparation, they don't have a very scripted style mindset, and they share their tools and their sort of approach and their thinking on the topic. And as these essays have sort of compounded and one has referenced another, someone has taken up GMing and has used this sort of school of thought, they then write it down again, and through the generations it's also become a criticism of the idea that preparation matters, or that players will notice, or that it will add value to the game. And I think that especially when you're sort of in the front lines and you see social media comments, as I saw a few kind of somewhere down in a Nerdarchy video last week, I think you'll see some people say, well, you know, you're making too much of it. No one cares. And let me tell you, first of all, you care. There's nothing that can come through more and animate a game session more than your passion and your verve when you're sitting in that chair or standing up, hopefully, and gesticulating, and knowing exactly what's on the tip of your tongue. Improvising, yes, but also being able to reference a vast wealth of ideas that have sort of dwelt in your mind over the last week, since the last time the game concluded. And that's really what I want to talk about, is what effective prep is, what useful prep is, and where the time spent should be. For me, point one is literally just thinking about the game. Thinking about the game a lot. Lying in bed at night, waking up in the morning, driving the car. Not writing much down, but cultivating a knowledge. For me, it also means going back through the setting material, kind of brainstorming ways for the setting to interact with the people, and always paying attention to how humanity can come into play. This is also sort of where I like to sort of reject a little bit of what people will use as their examples of how they fill up sessions among these improvisers. One of the things that I just read in an essay from an improviser is that they like to have exposition in the form of an NPC telling a lore story in character. Show, don't tell. If you have prepared and you kind of have a knowledge of what this essential element of the setting or story that you want to expose come to light, then you really ought to have an episode happen. Yes, it's excellent to have an orphan child accuse the dragon of kidnapping its mother, but it's much better for the players to see it, for the players to be tasked with feeding this orphan, or taking him to a future guardian in a far village, and perhaps they will see destruction in the fields and flames rising from the corn as they do so. This is showing rather than telling. The present tense, zooming in on the player characters and their decisions, their reactions, and their feelings to what is in the world, that is the game. Lecturing is not. And I've learned this the hard way, from pointing at a map and gesticulating at the various events that are halcyon and remote from what's happening today. And I've wasted time with my friends that could have been much better spent had I a premeditation about how to show these ideas in a way that would be more exciting. And if I had that premeditation, I could fit it into a player-directed story at appropriate moments. I'm not going to get into too much detail. I'm going to leave it in a lofty, high-concept state and move on to the next kind of really valuable preparation for the game. And that's preparation for an exciting moment that can happen only when you generate a particular set of mechanics. This can come down to a combat encounter, of course, but I want to share with you an anecdote of a time where I was running a pretty vanilla and almost difficult for me to continue Pathfinder campaign, and there was a climactic moment where the players had successfully reached a self-destruct chamber in a dwarven fortress like Moria, and when they hit that button, the mountain was going to come down on an orcish army, hopefully choke the pass that they were using to invade the kingdom, and maybe the players would make it out alive. And so, in that cliffhanger moment that I knew was coming, they were going to get to that chamber, they were going to push the button, and have relatively few ideas about how they were going to get out alive. I used my own experience with watching a strange disaster movie, which was more like a long chase scene. That disaster movie was 2012, and what I did is I wrote down note cards of various horrible things happening as they were chased out of the dungeon. Walls collapsing, having to walk from one pillar to another, water rushing in from cisterns that had breached, perhaps the denizens of the dungeon now having to evacuate, the kobolds carrying their clutches of eggs, two men carrying baskets of everything they found valuable, and the players encountering them suddenly and having to decide whether they were going to get in a fight or call a truce. That was one of the most memorable and exciting moments for everyone that was at that table that day. It was one of the highest rated and really best positive feedback that I've ever received as a dungeon master. And it's because of those note cards, that prep. And I just laid those cards down on the table, and I had the players put their miniatures, their pawns, and move through that web of cards. I didn't have it all figured out. I improvised how those cards connected and which characters would end up together. I contrived, in the spur of the moment, how the players would become separated from each other and move down different paths. And then I also created a mini-game as these cards collapsed behind them and they had to evacuate the various tiers to the final exit. This is the sort of premeditation and thinking about next week's session that I think really should consume the imagination more than anything else. The next point of why preparation and thinking about the game, spending time away from the table on the game, which doesn't mean endless imagineering, endless statting things out and drawing maps of things that people may or may not interact with. The next thing that's most important to me, and the thing that I'm dealing with right now, and you may have detected in the Starfinder video, is preparation can be a cure to your own ambivalence about elements of the game. If there's a genre or an idea that you just don't find that exciting, if you think that your game is sort of becoming it's called GM burnout, one of the things that you can do is you can invest your passion into your game. You can do a lot to create beauty. Hopefully I'll be able to dig out some really fun notes that just included these really spontaneous sketches that I started making in really bored moments at work while we were doing some training on a task. And I ran pens and pens and pens dry, doing pages and pages and pages of pretty silly notes, but it allowed me to develop some rekindled passion for my 5th edition campaign, which was getting a little bit sad, a little bit tired, and then part of it was my frustration with the system, but it was also just kind of a lack of direction, and having those cartoons, those kind of fun moments in the back of my mind, that was definitely one of the things that kept me going and kept that game riding to a fairly fun conclusion. My final point on what preparation is to me and how it really enhances the game is about research, genre research, and just kind of grounding. I'm taking up the project of kind of rekindling my love of science fiction and kind of rediscovering what it is that I think is most important about that genre, so that when I get to the table at Starfinder and there's science fantasy flying about, I will have some knowledge of kind of what things I want to carry through that genre wormhole. And for me, that comes down to rediscovering old touchstones. For me, Babylon 5 is that hidden gem that really is unlocking what Starfinder is going to be to me, and I'm having to go back and rewatch it. And then there's a lot of novels by authors that I really love that I've kind of yet to read. And if I can master their canon and their universes, maybe I'll be better at creating my own. I talk a great deal on this channel about my love for Harn and its sort of medieval realism juxtaposed with fantasy. And I've done a great deal of research and reading about kind of actual medievalism, and I have a book that I'm reading right now about, yes, the revolt of 1381, right after the Black Death, when the English peasantry were sure that the king was going to... Well, it's complicated, but it's also a fuel for a lot of Baroque inspiration about what animates kind of that medieval world of nobility, peasants, markets, and tragedy. So there it is, an unscripted and unprepared, and perhaps ill-organized retelling of why I think preparation is useful and valuable for you as a game master. It's a cultivation of why you love to play this game in that different way that is being the game master. And this is coming from someone who has a largely improvisational style anyway. It's coming from someone who is a skeptic about whether a lot of what people do when they draw all those maps and they think all those thoughts is something much more like gardening or imagineering. It's much more like world building, and there's a very large subreddit on that topic, than it is about game mastering, about being a storyteller, a shepherd for a really fun bonding experience between several people as they pass through the looking glass into a shared world. But preparation and time away from the table, spent on the game itself, is invaluable. Not only when you're a beginner, but throughout your career in this hobby. Now, I know that I talked about how Stars of New Absalom, my science fantasy setting for Starfinder, that I would kind of be developing in parallel with the build-up towards the release of the game, would be something that would figure into this video. And I think that instead, what I'm going to do is ship it off into a video about something still more specific within the realm of GM prep. Something that's a very special kind of a cure for ambivalence and a setting of the stage. I call it designing to spec, where you have a particular set of ideas in mind, and as you go into setting creation, you have to fulfill those. You have to check those boxes, but you also have to obey the muse and your creative identity. That's next time on The Complex Games Apologist.
Thank you for checking out my channel. If you enjoyed what you've seen here, maybe check out one of my in-depth video essays on topics in the tabletop gaming world, or subscribe with alerts so that you get updated anytime I put up new content here on YouTube. And above all, let me know what you think about this topic and about my videos in general by leaving a like or a dislike, and especially your own opinions in the comments below.